out the way. All right, so Seven Seals, Prophecy of Revelation, we're slowly working our way through it. We're up to what's called the sixth trumpet, and which is what's called the second woe trumpet. So if you remember, this particular passage, we'll read it through just to refresh our memory of the passage, was about a vision of a great army of horses, or great army of horsemen. These horses were very unusual. They had heads like lions, and they were breathing fire and smoke and brimstone. And it talks about them wreaking great destruction. So this was the passage. One woe is past, talking about the previous trumpet. And behold, there come two woes more hereafter. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So this is an area, the area that we're looking at here to see this action and this fulfillment in history is around the river Euphrates. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the third part of men. So we're looking at a large destruction. We're looking at something that we can symbolically call the extinction of the third part of men, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and of brimstone. Brimstone is sulphur, for those that don't know, and which you probably remember is quite a yellow sort of a stone. It talks there about the breastplates of fire and of jacinth. Jacinth is a stone, a bluey, purpley type stone. And so we've got something seems to be reddish. We've got blue and we've got yellow. And it says, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone, which, as we're going to see, is very similar thought. Fire, brimstone, those two are the same. The smoke, possibly a bluey sort of a colour as well. But anyway, particularly mentions the fire and the smoke and the brimstone that comes out of their mouths. By these three was the third part of men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone. This is a major feature of this prophecy, is the fire and smoke and brimstone, which issued out of their mouths, for their power is in their mouth and in their tails, for their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk, neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. So this passage, if again we remember the previous one, was about the rise of Islam under the Arabians, the Saracen Empire, from about 600 AD. And that took over a very large part of the old Roman Empire. And then as that began to wane, we see that the Turkish peoples began to move into the area of Baghdad and the area that was controlled by the Caliph there. And they began to convert to Islam. And they then became a great nation as the Arabian nation began to wane and to sort of break apart. The Turks, with the same Islamic faith, they then took over and began to create a great empire. And these two prophecies, this and the previous one, are very similar because they're both about great Islamic empires. So if you remember, we had a look at the map. This was the greatest extent of the Ottoman Empire, covered the top of North Africa, down in Saudi Arabia, covered Medina and Mecca, where, of course, Islam came from. The river Euphrates here, going right up to the area we now know as Turkey, or used to be called Asia Minor, and right through here, right around the Black Sea, the area of Greece. Eventually they took Constantinople, and they extinguished the Eastern Roman Empire. So this prophecy is about, as well as the Ottoman Empire, it's really all about the extinction of the old imperial, the last of the old imperial Roman Empire. By this time, it was called the Byzantine Empire, and they brought it to a close. So this is up to about 1683, where they tried at this point, they were at this extent, they tried to overtake Vienna, and they just didn't succeed. Had they done that, then they probably would have swept right around. But the scripture indicated they were to only do certain things, and this was what they did. So we went through a lot of other things in the previous one. We went through some further explanation on that. But now we're going to have a look at some of the actual phrases there, some of the actual symbols in that prophecy. So I'm sorry if you missed last week's. It was recorded. If you want to get the context a bit more, you can always listen to that or have a look at that. It was the video was done as well. So it says the horsemen were 200,000. Now in the Greek, it reads 2 myriads. Now, myriad, as I think I mentioned last time, it sometimes can stand for just a large unspecified number, a very, very large number, like we might say multitudes. But it also can have the technical explanation of 10,000. So it's either talking about 2 lots of 10,000 times 10,000, in which case it's 200,000 or 200 million, or it's just saying 2 very large groups, okay, myriads of myriads. There's other places in the scriptures use the same word to describe the myriads of angels. Again, just an innumerable sort of a multitude. So we're talking about a very large number. Now, a lot of people today, when they want to take the book of Revelation and maybe bring it all up in the futurist understanding, they want to talk about how do we get this army, and take it quite literally, of 200 million. They start sort of trying to work out whether China's got enough to be able to, in conglomeration with Russia or somebody else, and whether they could sort of put forward an army of 200 million. What we're going to see here is that these nations that really grew into the Turkish empires, there was two basic aspects to the Turkish empires. There were 2 of them. The first one was the Seljuk Empire, and that was a particular tribe of the Turks, and they grew up into quite a big empire. And as we saw last week, that then waned, and the Mongol Empire came in for a while, and just when it looked as though it was being extinguished, there was another tribe called the Ottomans, and they were in the midst of the Seljuk Empire there, and then they grew up to cover that whole extent that we saw before, and they were the greater half of it. So in a sense, we have 2 great Turkish empires, all the same people, but sort of, 2 phases of it, if you like. And when you think that they began this around about the year 1000 AD or 1063 or so, and it went right up to the First World War. So, for about 900 years, this great empire had generations of horsemen. They were, as we mentioned, it was the time where cavalry was the dominant force, the dominant type of warfare, and they were completely really cavalry. And they had hordes. They were known, as we'll see in a moment, for great hordes of horsemen cavalry. And so when you think about that, we're not just talking about one army, we're talking about 900 years of these great empires, and it's generation after generation of cavalry and horsemen right up until the First World War. The fact that it mentions 2, specifically 2 myriads, that may indicate that there were to be 2 lots, in the sense of two Turkish empires, which history recognises, the Seljuks and then the Ottomans. Or it may mean just 200 million. And while that's pretty hard to believe, literally, we will see. I think maybe we may have clicked on something. Can we just activate this screen? Just click on that screen. That's the one. Should work now. So see a few quotes about the type of armies that they had. So this is talking about the Turks in the first time where they started coming into the Arabian area, or into the Baghdad area, the Euphrates area. They came from sort of further off to the east there in the north, and there were heaps of them, And so this quote is about that time. Says, as the subject nations marched under the standard of the Turks, their cavalry, both men and horses, were proudly computed by millions. One of their effective armies consisted of 400,000 soldiers, so that's just one of the armies. But as you can see there, even at one particular time, their horsemen were computed by the millions. So we're talking about vast numbers. Another quote here, this one from Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This was talking about the time where the Sultan, who was part of the previous Arabian Empire, started to have the Turks converting to Islam, and they started to come in and to help them, and they became their soldiers and mercenaries and this sort of thing. But they became a bit nervous about the fact that there were so many of them. And so at one time, this quote here is about that thought. The Sultan had inquired what supply of men he, a chief of the Seljuks, the Turks, could furnish for military service. If you send, replied Ismail, one of these arrows into our camp, 50,000 of your servants will mount on horseback. And if that number, continued Mahmud, should not be sufficient, send this second arrow to the horde of Balak, and you will find 50,000 more. But, said the governor, Ghaznavid, dissembling his anxiety. In other words, he was sounding them out to see how many they had. And he said, you get 50,000, send an arrow, you'll get 50,000, send another arrow, you'll get another 50,000. And he started to get a bit anxious. He says, dissembling his anxiety, he said, if I should stand in need of your whole force, of your kindred tribes, dispatch my bow, was the last reply of Ismail, and as it is circulated around, the summons will be obeyed by 200,000 horse. So, again, already, right at the beginning, the vast numbers of horsemen, and that's what they were famous for. And you see a picture there of, shooting the arrow backwards while the horse is going forwards. Very skilled. Again, another quote from Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, when he describes this particular time and these people, he actually uses the word myriads. And he says, the myriads of Turkish horse overspread a frontier of 600 miles from Taurus to Erzurum, and the blood of 130,000 Christians was a grateful sacrifice to the Arabian prophet. The name of Alp Arslan, the valiant lion, in other words, that name means the valiant lion. This fellow was the successor to the first guy who went out on behalf of the Arabs and began to set up the Seljuk Empire and to attack the West. His name was the Valiant Lion in the understanding of their language. Says is expressive of the popular idea of the perfection of man, and the successor of Togrul, who was the first guy, displayed the fierceness and generosity of the royal animal. In other words, he was like a lion. Okay, we say that about a lot of brave people and soldiers, but it mentions it here. He was in name and he was in character. He passed the Euphrates at the head of the Turkish cavalry and entered Caesarea, the metropolis of Cappadocia, to which he had been attracted by the fame and the wealth of the Temple of Basil. So this is when they went out and began to attack the Eastern Roman Empire. It was about 1071. There was a great battle which really cemented things and pretty much cemented the eventual failure of the Eastern Roman Empire. So as it mentions there, they passed out from the Euphrates. These angels of destruction the Bible talked about in this great army of horsemen was to issue forth from the Euphrates area. And that's what happened in this particular time. And they actually crossed the Euphrates to begin these attacks. So again, the historians talk about the myriads of Turkish cavalry. So this is another quote from Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he talks about Solomon here. He's actually, from what I've read, he got that wrong. Other historians have said he was actually talking about his. This quote is actually talking about his son. But anyway, just so you know that, in case you know your history very well and you think this is wrong. It is wrong. Admonished his subjects and allies of this strange invasion of the Western barbarians. The Turkish emirs obeyed the call of loyalty or religion. The Turkmen hordes encamped around his standard, and his whole force is loosely stated by the Christians at 200 or even 360,000 horse. Now, this was during the time of the Crusades. So what happened was, as the Soviet Empire began to grow, and they had this great battle with the Eastern Roman Empire, then the West began to panic, and the Eastern Roman Empire, I think the emperor was actually taken. He was actually taken captive at that time by the Turks, and of course they needed a new emperor. But they then requested help from the West, and the West, panicking a bit themselves, they initiated the Crusade. So then there was these great battles between supposedly what was called the Christian forces and the Islamic forces there during this time. Again, a different quote from a different book here, just a more general book. This quote here is taken from a fellow by the name of Knowles, who was writing in 1623, so much closer to the time that some of these things were happening and at the peak of the Ottoman Empire. So it talks about different aspects of their cavalry and their army. It says there, the institution of the Timariots and Azamoglians were the two main pillars of their military government. The Timariots were veteran soldiers. The 12th Emperor Amrath III created 40,000 new Timariots in his Persian conquests alone. They amounted in all to 719,000 fighting men, of which 257,000 resided in Europe and 462,000 in Asia and Africa. Beside the Timariot horse, so that we're talking about cavalry there, as far as it seems to indicate, again, hundreds of thousands who served without pay and were called forth occasionally. They had a standing body of cavalry in pay, Spahis, etc., who were remarkable for their discipline and attachment. The Sultan employed also great bodies of light horse called Akanzi, whom they hired from the Tartars in the east and the Wallachians and Moldavians in the west, until the latter revolted with the Transylvanians. From the Azamoglans, or children of Christians. So you get from all these different groups there, obviously there's vast numbers of horsemen. And that's just at one particular moment in time. We've got 900 years over which these empires were in existence. And a threat. From the Azamoglans, or children of Christians, who were collected every third year as a tribute, about 9 years old and instructed in the Turkish language and religion, they culled out the most promising boys for strength, activity and courage to compose the Janissaries and Spahis, or Emperor's Lifeguard. Janissaries were usually selected from the European Christians and formed a body from 10 to 12,000 men of the best infantry of the world. I just put that one in because it shows one of the things they did, which is quite a cruel thing. They took the captive out of the captive Christians. They took their children and made them Islamic, and made them, in fact, special Islamic soldiers to fight against the so-called Christians. Again, it's quite a mess here because we know that a lot of those, the so-called Christian forces at this time are not Christian at all, and in fact were being pretty much punished by the Lord for their idolatry. Of course, the Islamic empires, both the Arabians and the Turks, Islam was very much against idolatry, and so you had a lot of idolatry both in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe, and these nations were in conflict with each other. So another one of the symbols was, it says the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. Now, in the previous trumpet, it had talked about the fact that the locusts, which looked like great army of horsemen, that they had teeth like lions. And again, the thought is that they were ferocious. It talks about the ferocity, and again, they are lion-like, as the scripture talks about different people in the Old Testament, different races from different, some of the enemies of Israel talks about them being lion-like men. Okay, so again, it indicates that they were fierce and ferocious. So a few quotes about some of those things. This is to do with Constantinople when it was finally taken and the Eastern Empire, Roman Empire, extinguished by the Turks. Mehmet was the Sultan at the time, and after the battle, or during the battle, it says Mehmet rode over to the Anatolian troops on his right flank, stationed just beyond the St. Romanus Gate. These men were heavy infantry equipped with chain armour, experienced, disciplined, and fired by a strong Muslim zeal for the cause. They came on, said Nicola Barbera, like lions unchained against the walls. Now, this fellow, Nicola Barbera, he was a Venetian surgeon who was actually in the city of Constantinople at the time, so he's an eyewitness, and he just managed to escape the city as it was being overrun by getting in a ship. Two sides of the city were sea walls. He managed to escape on a ship and get out and take his story back. So he describes them as coming on like lions unchained against the walls. At another signal, the infantry advanced with a loud and terrifying war cry, not like Turks, but like lions. So again, it's Niccolò Barbera making this eyewitness account. So there are a lot of different people down through the ages who have been described as lion-like, particularly in battle. So you can't just say that because somebody is described as a lion that is a definite proof that these people represent the prophecy. But what it does indicate is that they fit the imagery, and other people might fit the imagery, but you've got to get all the symbols fitting. So again, this one is another quote from another book, The Slave Kings and the Islamic Conquest. It says, countless Muslim authors have left us graphic descriptions of what they considered the essential attributes of the Turks as an ethnic group and the reasons for the latter's preeminence in the Islamic world from the 11th century onwards. All authors of adab works, manuals of war, and mirrors for princes agree on the military superiority of the Turks, their hardiness, their skill with horses, and the bow and arrow, as well as their lion-like qualities and prizes. It's interesting there that they say countless Muslim authors and Arabian authors, they all look at the Turks and they characterise them as being particularly lion-like, and of course their great skill with horses. Again, a quote a bit later there, it says, ultimately the lion-like Turk was linked to the climate of his country of origin, which predisposed him to a certain robustness and military valour. They're just saying that the area that he came from, it was tough and bred them tough, I suppose was the thought, and very lion-like. Again, this one is from a poem, a very famous poem, and it's by a Persian poet, Izzy, if that's how you say it, and it's about the Turks, and this is what he has to say. He says, they are like pheasants when they hold the wine cup, they are like lions when they hold the sword and spear. In battle, they burn more fiercely than the fires of hell, which is an interesting comment because the imagery there, again, sort of fits with the idea of the horsemen with the heads like lions and out of their mouths coming forth fire and brimstone and smoke. And they're burning, as it said in the previous quotes, with the zeal of Islam. So they're fired up, they're motivated by Islam and very ferocious, and that's their character. He said they are fitter for the majlis than the houris of paradise. You're not quite sure what he's getting at there, but if you look it up, the majlis are sort of the, if you like, council or parliament, if you like. As he's saying there, maybe in paradise, the houris are all the lovely maidens, supposedly, that Islam talks about being in paradise. So sort of saying that they're majestic type fellows, important type people, and again, very lion-like. The poet, this quote continues, the poet continues in this vein at considerable length. The poem is very repetitive. Turks are compared with lions at least 4 times. So there was an interesting little comment this fellow made about this poem. Again, they're constantly being referred to as lions. This one is a very interesting one. It's actually has to do with a Chinese quote about the Turks at this particular time. written by a traveller who was an Arabian traveller, I think it was, and he went to China, and this was what the Chinese had to say. So the opinions of the Chinese as to the relations with the rest of the world are collected from the following continuation of Masudi's account. After ourselves follows the king of the lions. This is the king of the Turks, our neighbour. They are men lions. That's interesting. It's the way that they characterised them at the time. He said, next to them ranks the king of the elephants, that is to say, the king of India. So, I don't know what we would be, the king of the Kiwis over here or something. There then follows the Byzantine king, which was the Eastern Roman Empire king, whom we call the king of men. For no men on earth have better constitution or finer countenances than the Byzantines. So this guy Masudi was an Arabian historian and traveller who wrote in the 10th century. So that's interesting. It talks about the Turks as being the lions, talks about the Byzantine as being men, because this scripture says that these lion-like horsemen will slay the third part of men. And so again, the men relating to the Eastern Roman Empire there, that's what happened. They brought them to extinction. There we go for time. Okay. All right, let's see if I can get through this section here. So what happened was when they finally took over all of the old Eastern Roman Empire, there was only one place left, and that was the fortified city of Constantinople. The Arabians had tried to take it over on a couple of occasions. I think Attila the Hun tried to take it over at one stage. It was extremely fortified, very good position, very hard to take, and they hadn't been successful. But it was a change. New technology came into effect at this time, and it was the discovery of gunpowder, and it was the discovery of being able to use artillery to attack the old great walls of some of these fortified cities, and that changed warfare. And this was in 1453. There was a sultan, Mehmet II, and he heard about this new technology, and he thought that might be useful to break down those walls so they could actually get in there. And so that's actually what happened. As we look into the history here, it was because of the invention, and he did a lot of preparation to take this city. It was the grand prize, and he did years of preparation. And one of the things they did, they had a fellow who was either Danish or Hungarian, the story goes. He was on the Greeks' side, but they weren't feeding him, and he sort of ended up starving. And anyway, he got taken captive by the Turks, and he thought he was a guy who knew how to this new technology of how to found a cannon, how to cast a cannon. And so he got taken before the Sultan, and the Sultan asked him questions, and he defected. He went over because he was getting fed, he was getting plied with riches and all sorts of things. And they said, if you'll build us some cannons, then, your life is set. So he did, and they began to found these huge cannons. We'll see in a moment. You can see a bit of one there. And then they prepared them, and then they travelled. Can't remember how long it took them, about 2 months or something, to get them from where they created them to the city of Constantinople. Apparently it took something like 30 wagons. They used 30 wagons to sort of transport these things with about 60 oxen. They had a couple of hundred people, men, sort of on either side of them to keep them in order. They had another about 250, I think the story goes, men who were sort of smoothing the way in before. And as I say, it took them about 2 months to get the stuff in place. So there was huge amounts of preparation. When they first tested one of these, they gave a day's warning to everybody in the area because these had great stone balls that they would shoot. Apparently the ball was about 12 palm widths wide, and when the gun went off, it sort of shook the ground for a very long way away. And people, of course, weren't used to those sort of sounds back then, so they didn't want everybody to panic. And then they took these things into the battle. So just to remind you, this was Constantinople. It's actually this little horn here. And so it has a little inlet on the side here, which is fairly wide at the mouth. And so this triangular bit here was Constantinople. So it had a sea wall on one side, a sea wall on the other side, and on the third side was the land wall. And it was very hard to get into. If you came from the land side, they was extremely well fortified. But getting in from the seaside was extremely difficult as well. They had a very fortified wall. And of course, you had the sea there. Also in this area here, I think it's called the Horn of something or other, they had a huge chain and sort of going across this vast area here and anchored on both sides to keep enemy ships out from this area to protect that side wall. And that comes into the story in a moment. So again, for all of these reasons, it was very difficult to take the city. Here's another bit of a shot of it. So again, this is the sea wall on one side. This is the horn of, I can't remember what the name of it is now, but anyway, it had this, across this area here, it had this vast chain and a couple of towers on both sides, and the Turks were not able to bring it down either, so they bypassed it. And again, the main wall was on the other side there. So this is what the walls look like. Some of the walls are still in existence in Istanbul. Constantinople, once it was taken by the Islamic forces, its name was changed to Istanbul. It had a great moat out the front here, and then it had the first wall. It then had a larger second wall behind that with towers, and then behind that was the main wall, which you can't actually see from here. Again, some of this still exists, some has been reconstructed, but you can see the towers of it. So the biggest wall was the one at the back. They had to get through a great moat over the first wall, over the second wall, then over the third wall. So you can see why it's not the sort of thing you would want to be the foot soldier who's told to charge against this place. This is what it looked like. Here's the great moat. That was the first wall we saw, and you can see a little man at the top there. So they've got to go here, jump down in this chasm, take their scuba gear, get up this other wall up here on the other side, or somehow get over there. And while they're doing all that, they've got two towers up here and two other walls which are shooting arrows at them all the time. They then get to get out over this fortification. And then when they get in here, they've got the biggest of all to get through. So that's a top view there of, again, you've got the moat, the first wall, second wall, and third wall. So that's what they were up against. That's why nobody had been able to take it. So then there was this discovery at around that time. In the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he describes how that this happened and how the city was taken, and he credits it to the discovery of gunpowder and the ability to actually make these cannons. So he says the chemists of China or Europe had found by casual or elaborate experiments that a mixture of saltpeter, sulphur, and charcoal produces with a spark of fire a tremendous explosion. It was soon observed that if the expansive force were compressed in a strong tube, a ball of stone or iron might be expelled with irresistible and destructive velocity. So cannons were born, and of course guns and various other things after that. So this is what they looked like. This is one of the real things. They were different sizes. Some of them were absolutely massive, some of them smaller. The two parts here, probably for transporting them around, I dare say. It'd be a bit hard to screw that thing in there, but that's how they looked. So massive things. They would fire for so long and then usually blow apart and take all the people around them with them. So there's a bit of a picture here of how they went. So these are the big cannons here. They were able to get them close enough. You've got the moat over there. They were able to break down the walls so that they were able to get in. Without the gunpowder and the cannons and everything else, they found it pretty hopeless. They tried many times sort of charging against the place, but it was the cannons that made the day. So again, another quote here from Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The great cannon of Mahomet has been separately noticed, an important and visible object in the history of the times. And that's interesting because, again, that's, it says this is an important visible object in the history of the times, and that's why the prophecy makes such a point about the fire and the smoke and the brimstone issuing out of the mouths and destroying the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire. But that enormous engine was flanked by two felloes almost of equal magnitude. The long order of the Turkish artillery was pointed against the walls. 14 batteries thundered at once on the most accessible places, and of one of these it is ambiguously expressed that it was mounted with 130 guns, or that it discharged 130 bullets. So anyway, whatever way, it was a massive amount of firepower, something the world really hadn't seen on that sort of scale before. There had been, I believe, they'd started to make artillery, but to use it against a major city like this was the first time, and some very big weapons. So again, from the lines, the galleys and the bridge, the Ottoman artillery thundered on all sides, and the camp and the city, the Greeks and the Turks were involved in a cloud of smoke, which could only be dispelled by the final deliverance or destruction of the Roman Empire. Again, sort of mentions, they were destroyed in the smoke, the great warfare and the firepower that was going on there, just as the prophecy indicates the same thing, the great the smoke clouds that came with its destruction. This, again, is another bit of a drawing of the area of Constantinople, not really to scale, but from this side we're looking at it from the wall side, from the land side. This is the triangular city of Constantinople, or up here, and this is what they call the Horn, the inlet there. So you've got sea walls on these two sides, and again the land wall here somewhere. You've got they've showed a bit of a construction there which represents the chain and the barrier to stop ships getting in there. But what they did was, as well as having on the land these great cannons, they also had cannons upon the ships, upon the galleys. And so from both sides, from this side first of all, they began to shell the walls. And because they couldn't get into here, and it was too difficult, they couldn't overcome this area here, they decided to bring the ships overland. So back here, they carried the ships, these huge ships, over the hills and through in behind on the other side. They brought the ships into the sea here, and then they began to shell the walls on this side. And that was a major blow to the city and a major factor. So it's hauling the ships overland. This is where they did it. There's the Islamic soldiers there. They're hauling these great galleys up over the hills, and they get it up eventually into the inlet. It allows them to shoot from that side. You might note the colours in here. They are red, yellow, and blue. You'll find that in the Turkish designs all over the place. They also use green on occasion. That represents the Prophet Muhammad, but they only sort of use that for descendants, literal descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So we have these three colours, which actually correspond to fire, jacinth, and sulphur, or brimstone, which the scripture said they were arrayed in those colours. So again, we'll just finish on this particular one. Well, these couple of slides here. This one is actually taken from, this is a Muslim historian who was writing in 1536 to 1599, sometime there. So he was either an eyewitness or, very close to the time. So this is from the Muslim perspective of the Turkish perspective of what they saw, the destruction of Constantinople. So it says, at length the Muslims placed their cannon in an effective position and threw up their entrenchments. The gates and the ramparts of Constantinople were pierced in 1,000 places. The flames which issued from the mouths of these instruments of warfare, of brazen bodies and fiery jaws, cast grief and dismay amongst the miscreants. So this has no connection with the biblical prophecy, but this is a Muslim describing in his imagery what was happening. And he's talking here, and it sounds very similar to the prophecy, flames issuing from the mouths of these instruments of warfare, brazen bodies and fiery jaws. casting grief and dismay amongst them. Then it says the smoke, which spread itself in the air and ascended towards the heavens, rendered the brightness of the day sombre as night, and the face of the world soon became as dark as the black fortune of the unhappy infidels, referring to the Eastern Romans. So, again, very similar sort of imagery to what the prophecy talks about. You can see how that's been fulfilled in the things that happened there at that time. I won't go any further. We've gone late enough today. But again, it starts talking about some of the other symbols there. There's a couple more. We'll go through them next time.